Hey everyone, welcome to the very first episode of DevOps Unbound. I'm your host Alan Schimmel, and joining us for this initial episode of DevOps Unbound, I'm proud and happy to introduce you to James Bach and Grigory Melnick. Grigory, James, welcome to DevOps Unbound.
Hey everyone.
Before we jump into things, let me give each of you an opportunity to kind of introduce yourselves, your backgrounds, your positions, etc., so that our audience kind of knows a little bit, if they don't already, who you both are. So, Grigory, you've already been a guest on our show, so if you don't mind, I'm going to ask James to go first. James, introduce yourself. Go ahead.
My name is James Bach. I'm a consulting software tester. I started as a developer in my teen years after I dropped out of high school. I'm the proudest high school dropout you will ever meet. I later wrote a book about dropping out of high school and my particular self-education method. But my big opportunity came when Apple Computer hired me to be a test manager. And at the time, I was the youngest manager in the R&D division of Apple Computer. So that's kind of something I'm proud of. And I fell in love with testing, and I decided to devote my career to testing. I studied the epistemology of testing, the mathematics of testing, the sociology of testing. I am a bit obsessed with testing. And
to say the least.
I wrote a book about that called Lessons Learned in Software Testing with a couple of co-authors. And now I teach and consult.
Excellent. And you know what? High school dropout or not, you've done pretty darn good. So congratulations. And not saying it's an example for our younger people in the audience to necessarily emulate. Of course, James grew up
My son did better than me. He never went to high school, so I'm
really
he's already outdone me.
Absolutely. Very good. Grigory, why don't you tell them a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm Grigory Melnick, and I'm the Chief Product Officer of Tricentis, focusing on building the testing tooling of the future, testing tools for the future. Previously, I guess I spent almost 2.5 decades focusing on the developer audience and building all kinds of platforms at Microsoft and Splunk and MongoDB, and always been kind of customer obsessed in a sense of developer obsessed quite a bit, making sure that whatever we were focusing on would help drive the productivity and alleviate some of the pains that developers in our target audience had. A few of those things that I'm particularly proud of, my team at Microsoft was actually the first one that built the very first auto-scaling for what was back known as Windows Azure, now Microsoft Azure, but also focused on common patterns and practices and implementing the cross-cutting components that represent cross-cutting concerns that later would make into the .NET framework. So again, a lot of work identifying those patterns, capturing them, externalizing them, testing them out, and then helping drive the reuse. When it comes to testing, I first kind of discovered it in my days in academia when I was doing research and teaching at university. And it was quite interesting because testing was predominantly viewed through the lens of formal method proofs. It wasn't really viewed as an activity, as an intellectual activity of discovery, as an intellectual activity of exploring or experiencing something. And those were actually the days when I've encountered the group of testers from the context-driven school of testing, including James, and we kind of kept in touch ever since. Even with me gravitating away from the testing more into the developer world, and now doing like the full loop of coming back to testing. And I have to tell you, I felt, when the opportunity came, I felt that the world of testing, at least from the perspective of how the discipline itself has advanced, would be way further developed in the last decade than I found it, after kind of leaving it for a while. So I'm now on the mission of kind of reigniting that whole discipline and putting it more on a pedestal and giving it more view and empowerment and leveling up all around. So yeah.
Excellent. So thank you both, gentlemen. And I'm Alan Schimmel. I'm the editor-in-chief, CEO for MediaOps, the folks behind DevOps.com, Container Journal, Security Boulevard, TechStrong TV, etc. And just quickly before we jump into today's agenda, DevOps Unbound, though today's focus is on testing, is not just about testing. It's really about DevOps kind of unbound, setting us free, right? Being able to leap tall buildings and, bound into space, or freeing ourselves of gravity, whatever you want. It's about speed. It's about acceleration, right? It's about automation in a lot of ways. And we're going to be doing these every other week, and each episode will focus on particular aspects of this unbound nature, if you will. Today's is testing. And then once a month, we're also going to have a roundtable with about 6 or 8 people of Grigori and James's stature, and we'll open it up to the public for live audience questions and discussion. So I'm really looking forward to that. DevOps Unbound is sponsored by our friends at Tricentis, and we thank them for it. And with that out of the way, let's jump into things. So Grigori, I wanted to start off, obviously you and James take very different paths to and both of you have been very successful in your lives and careers. So it just goes to show there's more than one way to skin the cat, right? But let's take a look. Look, I'm probably older than both of you, though not that much, I'm sure. But let's look at the historical context of where you guys come from to be sitting here today, and how that, vis-a-vis is kind of the whole testing industry, the whole testing, you want to call it a profession, the guild, the whatever you want to call it, right? How has this evolved over the years? And let's put some context in with time frames. James, when you first went to Apple, without saying you're old, what kind of, what were the time frames for that?
Well, I am old.
So am I.
But you're older, which is nice. It's nice to be a young guy in the room again.
Uh-huh. Yeah, I can't tell you how well that makes me feel, but go ahead.
1st, 1987. May 21st, 1987 was the first day that I ever professionally tested something as a tester. Before that, I was doing video game development, and I had done informal testing, and I hated testing because testing just got in the way of me shipping my product. So I didn't like testing until it became my job. And then I realized I'm perfect for testing because I love complaining. And I'm much more interested in finding how things don't work than to figure out how to make them work.
That's interesting. My background's in cyber, or back then we called it InfoSec. And in InfoSec, most of the people who got into InfoSec got into it because they like to break things, right? Yeah, same thing. Grigori, how does that, time frame wise and everything else, how does that match up with your own experience?
So I like to actually build things. I'm like
Okay.
you guys who are breaking things, and occasionally I break things. And actually, this also speaks about this overall, optimism of most developers who think that what they write is perfect, and always underestimate the amount of buggy code that we put in there. So. But to me, if I think about my first day when I actually had my job as an engineer, actually, it was September, I think, 5th, 1990, so a few years after James. And at that time, I was actually writing a C library for a PC, converting the data from mainframe into the visual format, and had to deal with all kinds of quirks of Fortran and the 80 characters limit and the asterisks for for bringing to the continuation of the line, all kinds of exciting stuff. But back to to make sure that I don't go too far on the tangent, we actually didn't have for a very, very long time. Again, I'm giving you my angle into the testing, if you will. We actually didn't have a dedicated thinking about testing as an activity, as a pursuit of excellence. It was just something that you kind of were doing, and then at some point later you've heard and learned that, oh wait, look, there is a QA department apparently, right? And they're the ones that were mostly viewed as gatekeepers or police of some sort. Right, and then again, if I think about, again, once I got more into the research in academia and studying testing specifically, because I'm probably one of the very few people who has testing in the title of my PhD dissertation. But I remember looking back and thinking, well, what did it come from, right? What did actually software engineering come from, right? And of course, this is where the history of the conference back, after the war in Garmisch, where all the stalwarts of at that time computer science and not even computer science, mathematics departments, because that's who were doing all the programming back then, had coined the software engineering discipline. And later on, this association of debugging, right, with the infamous story of how the moth was found in Harvard University scientific lab, and the term debugging was coined. I almost think like in the early days, it was very much associated with this era of debugging, right? Then later on, the era of this ability to demo the fact that the software was matching the spec or the requirements. There was, I think, it almost feels like there were at least a decade when people were fixated, and some would argue that it's still continuing.
What decade was that? What decade are you referring to?
The debugging or the debugging, I'd say.
Are you talking about the 70s? Are you talking about the 60s? Are you talking about the 50s?
I'm talking about 50s and 60s. I'm talking about the 50s and 60s as almost the era of debugging, the way I viewed it. Then after that, the era of more like 70s and 80s, where you were focusing more on matching the spec and demoing that the software would actually, or proving. And this is where this big focus was on formal methods and trying to even mathematically prove that software worked according to the spec. And then after that, I feel like the next era was the era of breaking, or something that probably is still continuing as well. And again, all these elements I feel are present in today's profession of testing. But the later years, the last 20 years, was everything that I was kind of studying, watching from the sidelines, getting myself into. I like to call it the era of enlightenment, if I may. I know that's super pompous of me, but this is where I view more testing in the way how James and other members of the context-driven school of testing had formulated it, which is, lighting the way for the decision maker. Not for the developer necessarily, not for, again, it could be for the developer, but somebody who at the end of the day makes the decision whether what is being produced is acceptable enough, or if it's good enough to ship. Is it what risks associated there, and informing me as a decision maker about all these different factors, and then leaving that decision up to me. So the testers are not the police. They're not the quality gate. They're not assuring anything. It's really up to the stakeholder who is commissioning all this effort and who makes the ultimate decision about releasing something, putting something into production.
I'd like to offer some historical notes
Please.
On this. Okay, first, are you aware what the first book was on the subject of software testing? First known book? Little quiz for you, Grigory.
Is it the Myers book?
It's before that. It's Program Test Methods from 1972 by Bill Hetzel. Now, that book was a report on a conference, a testing conference, which was the Chapel Hill conference, which happened in 72. That seems to have been a historical watershed event in testing. Before that, the first chapter on software testing that I've been able to find was written in 1961 by my teacher, Jerry Weinberg, who wrote it when he was 25 years old. It's a brilliant chapter on testing. What's fascinating to me is how differently Weinberg talks about testing in 1961 compared to how they talked about testing in 1972, although there is a reference in the 1972 book back to Weinberg praising Weinberg's attitude about testing. It's fascinating to read that, because the book in 1961, it's Computer Programming Fundamentals, and the chapter about testing was written by Jerry, he told me, although it's co-written. The book's co-written with Herbert Leeds and Jerry Weinberg, but Jerry wrote the chapter on testing. And Jerry talks about testing as a matter of imagination, not automation, as a matter of being suspicious and critical, as a fundamentally unalgorithmic process. And he develops this beautiful story in his chapter about a programmer who's sure that he's found the last bug, and then finds out that he's wrong. And then he adds another check for that, and then he's sure now he's found the last bug, and then he sees something else go wrong. And Jerry's conclusion is, look, this is just, we're working on complex systems, and this is always going to be like this. Now, Jerry was on the first project in 1958 that ever had a dedicated test team. Now, the reason why he knows that is that in 1961, IBM held a conference of all the computer programmers in the entire world, of which there were 400 apparently. And Jerry said his team went to that conference. He was at IBM at the time. And he said everyone thought they were crazy because they had a dedicated group of testers and no one else did. They all were just testing their own stuff. So it seemed like the idea of having a dedicated test team caught on. And then in 1972, the way they talked about testing was all about test cases, automation, formality, and that kicked off the era, I think, of the factory, the test factory. We can have technology and we can have procedures that make it so you don't rely on human thinking. So this goes against what Jerry Weinberg was preaching, not only back in 61, but all through his career. I became a student of Jerry's in around 1989 and took all his classes in mid-90s, and he became a mentor to me. That's why I'm a real acolyte of Jerry Weinberg, because he always put the human in the center of everything. But testing, when I joined testing, all the testing textbooks were about how you have to define test cases and, if possible, automate them. And I felt like that was a fool's idea. I think, well, the problem is that there's too many things to define, and far from being unbound, we become super bound by all of these documents and all of this code. And so if you want to be unbound, we have to find a way to temper that. We have to find a way to interact with our tools so that we're not constrained too much by them. And that, in the 90s, the urge to unbind ourselves from that waterfall world and that heavy documentation world created Agile, but it also created the context-driven school of software testing, which is a humanist approach to software testing. And that was in the mid-90s that we started creating that. And then DevOps and Agile continued to sort of take over the world, except that it seems to me that Agile in a lot of places has lost its humanist foundation, and it's turned into tools. And so if we're going to really talk about Unbound, DevOps Unbound, it seems to me that we have to be specific about what is it we're unbinding. I hope what this means is it's people being unbound, using DevOps as a tool rather than.
But not just the tool. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to jump in. But not just, you know what, James? We don't want to make the same mistake that Agile made. And you just said one of the problems with the Agile is we went from humanist to tools, right? Too much of a reliance on tools. Let's not make the same mistake in DevOps. And I think that's something I've advocated for a while, too, is we can't lose the human in DevOps. The humans
Actually, I
of
want to hear
DevOps.
you say more about that, Alan, if you're willing to say a little more about that.
I'm not shy. I'll give you my 2 cents. I started DevOps.com. I cover this place. I cover this area pretty heavily, and I have for 7 or 8 years now. And I think there's been this, and I don't want to say Agile failed, because Agile is far from a failure. But there has been a reliance on tools and maybe overly processed. You know, when we think about things like IDLE and ITSM versus DevOps, let's say, right? We tend to point fingers at IDLE, and ITSM and said, too much process, too heavy, too many, too much of that whole change management thing. But there are good things there. Nothing's all bad and all good. The world's not black and white. It's gray, right? And so there are things we take out of IDLE and things and ITSM that we put into DevOps. But DevOps, to me anyway, and it's just my humble opinion, is fundamentally about people and teams and culture. Not the tools. There's a lot of tools we could use, and there's overlap in tools, and what's the best tool for any given job? We could fight about it till the cows come home. But at its nitty gritty, DevOps is making sure that devs and ops and test and security and these people work with a higher degree of communication, right? With a higher degree of cooperation, getting jobs done faster. And we do that by adding things like automation to the mix. But automation for automation's sake alone is not enough, right? And to do automation, yes, you got to use tools sometimes to make that automation work. I get it. But if we lose the fundamental aspect that DevOps is at its core about humans, I think we lose what DevOps is. And I don't hold myself out to be as accomplished as either one of you, but I do
still
firmly
love
believe
you,
that.
Alan. I love what you just said. I think this is, if you can hold on to what the principle and the feeling behind what you just said, we can do anything with tools and we'll be okay. We'll be okay if we're talking to each other, if we're caring about each other. I keep seeing people losing that. And of course, any technology and any methodology, when it is applied sociopathically, will become abuse.
Yeah.
And so we just, those of us who can, should do whatever we can to keep it non-abusive and keep us talking. And then I think DevOps can be a wonderful thing.
Absolutely. I'm sorry to take us down that. Go ahead, Grigori.
No, it's super encouraging to hear what you said, Alan. And again, I'm a very big believer into the greatness of human mind. But it feels to me that in this kind of history of our industry, the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth, right? Remember the whole infatuation with the case tools, back in the back in the 80s and 90s, and then later on there was this whole big movement of the software factories. Like the term was actually software factories, where the idea was that you can go and abstract away at some high level, and then the loop. The tools will generate, all the code and everything for you and make it all highly maintainable, all of that. And of course that failed too. But I think it's out of this desire for some reason to come up with these boosters. So I don't know, some kind of the way of equipping the humans to deal with the inherently complex problems, where today there's no better mechanism of dealing with them other than human brain is. So this whole vision of, computers writing computer code. I mean, that's been promised in the first era of AI. Not today, but I'm talking about the 60s, right? In the 70s,
Yeah.
where all
I mean,
those
Spielberg
people,
does
and then it
pictures.
kind of died out, right? Same
Uh-huh.
thing again. Doing having the computers entirely come up with the test strategy. Thinking about testing automatically, entirely automatically. I think it's utopical. At least if you think about what the tools are capable of doing today, and for a very, very long time in the future, I think the human will remain to be at the center of this activity. While again, all the tooling is great, because tooling gives you additional powers and additional ways of perhaps automating the most rudimentary, the most boring elements of the job, and lets you actually free up time to think about new theories, new hypotheses, new models, new approaches.
But you got to consider different kinds of tools. Like, have you noticed the difference between, let's say, a tool like a programmer's IDE? When I use a programmer's IDE, I don't feel oppressed. I feel empowered. I feel like I'm riding a magic carpet and I have laser cannons mounted on it. I feel wonderful. But when I use most testing tools, I feel oppressed. Like I have just a few possible things I can do, and if I have any...
Like you're castrated.
That's outside of what the test tool designer has thought that I might want to do for testing, then I'm not allowed to do that. This is what I feel like when I encounter something like Cucumber, which is very restricted. In the Gherkin language, it's very restricted. It's stopping me from going on flights of imagination. And yet when I use the tools that programmers have created for programmers, unsurprisingly, programmers have created for programmers tools that make them feel powerful and free and able to do all kinds of wonderful things. I would like to bring the same sense of freedom to testing that programmers already enjoy. That's part of what we're doing with the transformation work we're doing at Tricentis.
Yeah, well,
I love that.
In all fairness, not all of the programmers' tools are that liberating. Some of them feel like you are operating in the straitjacket too. But in general, at least there are some examples. There are instances of tooling that are widely accepted, widely adopted today that are supporting and kind of accelerating your abilities to do your job without constraining you. That's for sure. And the piece that James was alluding to, this is actually the new initiative that we are driving inside Tricentis, about imagining this whole new platform of the test tools for the future, where we are building something akin to the IDE. We're actually not calling it IDE, we're calling it ITE, Integrated Testing Environment, where actually it's the human being, the human tester, who is in the very, very center of the ITE, and all these other snippets and utilities and services and everything around the human tester, around the human there, meant to support the individual in the way wherever his line of thought, line of exploration, line of test execution may lead to. Okay, so again, we're kind of envisioning this to be as a super configurable kind of morphing tool, almost like the chameleon style, where depending on the context and the environment, the different capabilities of the ITE, the integrated testing environment, will present themselves, and then the human will actually pick whether this is actually something that they want to take advantage or not, as opposed to, again, being forced into a specific kind of mold or one way of doing testing. And we don't think actually anybody has attempted something of this caliber, specifically in the space of test tooling before. That's why we're so enthusiastic and so passionate about this project. Aren't we, James?
I also don't think that anyone is going to be able to copy us easily, because the only way that they could actually compete with us is by hiring someone who loves testing, which test tool companies hate doing, because testers are troublemakers. I still can't really, it's hard for me to fathom that Grigory really knows what he's done by hiring me, because I'm a constant gadfly. I'm constantly complaining about the state of test tools in the world and at Tricentis, frankly, and I want things to be fundamentally better. But that means we have to fundamentally change how we think about what is a tester, which might get us into the role of testing a bit. But to me, a tester is a puzzle solver, a problem finder. I'm not a button pusher, and I'm not a verifier. I don't verify things. Tools can verify things. I'm not looking to prove that something works, because I can't prove that anything works. What I can do is collect evidence and then draw inferences from that evidence with a critical mindset. And of course, lots of tools are collecting facts about the products that I'm testing, and that can be automated. And so we're pulling in these facts, and we can say we got this output, and we expected to get this output. So apparently, there's no problem here as far as we can tell so far. But then the tester layers onto that a critical mindset, saying, "But how do we know? And how could we be fooling ourselves?" And so I'm bringing that mentality into Tricentis, and I'm really surprised so far. They've been actually quite welcoming of me. But for years and years, I've tried to help other tool companies with this, and basically, you know what reaction I get? They basically say, "Well, our customers just want to have automation that just pushes a bunch of buttons, and we don't really care about test design. We don't really care about empowering testers. So that's not going to help us make any money, James. So we're really not interested in supporting the skilled testers that you keep talking about." So Tricentis has a different kind of vision that I think is hard to match.
There's also a little bit of you can't make wine before it's time, right? And I think, right, I think you need the right macro conditions that things like DevOps have brought about, and the whole progression. I mean, we've gone back here now to the 50s and 60s and all the way to the present time. Certainly, the world we live in today, maybe I want to think so anyway. We're a little bit more open to the idea of saying, look, yeah, we can automate some stuff. We don't need a human to just push buttons, right? We have tools that can go push the buttons for us, but we need humans to do blank. We need humans to do some of this stuff, and so we need to enable and empower them to do that within the context of let's automate what should be automated, let's say, but we still need those humans in there. You know, when I was growing up, much like you guys, right? The only animal in the world that used tools was humans. Isn't that's what I learned in school, right? That's what separated us from animals. One of the things, right, was our ability to use tools. Well, then we found out chimpanzees used tools, and other monkeys used tools, and we still were okay with that because they were primates. Now we found birds use tools, right, to crack nuts and stuff like this. So tool use in itself does not connotate one's intelligence or higher being. We need to. So to me, that's the ultimate case, right? It's not about what tools we use. It's about how we use our brains, and I think that's apropos to what we see in testing today. Yes, we could come up with tools, but it's creating an environment for people to think in and use their brains in and apply it that I think will ultimately provide us the highest payback, if you will, right? And
it's interesting what you just said about you're implying that the history of how we got to where we are now is important, that we have to have a certain historical context, technological context, in order to take the next leap. And I think one thing in which that's really true is we now have decades as an industry, decades and decades of experience trying to eliminate people from engineering, and we can't do it. I remember, maybe you do, there were these advertisements in Byte magazine in the 80s about case tools. And now your marketing people can just define your product, and you don't need developers anymore because it automatically generates all the code. And I remember sitting there at Apple Computer reviewing case tools advertisements that had been sent to me, thinking, well, could I buy some of these tools and actually use them to help with the testing? And it turned out, no, you couldn't. It was just all hype and nothing. So I shrugged. And so even today, now we have AI. AI is the new case tool. And the AI will do all this stuff for you. Then it turns out the AI is biased and racist and confused. And if you put kitten ears on a whale, it says that's a kitten.
Yep. And it's no more than ML, the machine learning anyway. But yes, we have been chasing this white whale for most of my adult life. And at the same time, if it was a nation, the fastest growing nation on earth are developers. There's 40-something million is the estimate, growing 20% a year or something like that. So, I think it's time we stop probably chasing that white whale and move on to empowering people.
One way to do that, I suggest a definition of programmer or perhaps developer. And the definition I use is a developer is someone who stands at the gateway between the world of the machines and the world of humans. And the developer's purpose is to operate competently in the world of people and then operate competently in the world of machines. And if you don't have that person standing at the gateway, then you don't have a connection between the world of humans and the world of machines. You just have people kind of praying to the god of technology and hoping that good things happen. And so no matter how complicated technology gets, no matter how much AI we have, we still have the need to operate competently in the world of people, and the developers will always live right at that threshold. And testers need to live there too, and not get mowed under by automation.
And you know what, guys, that we're almost out of time, but this also brings up something that I thought we might be able to get to on this show, but we're running out of time, and that is that this caste system, if you will, case system of developers being a higher caste than the tester, who's higher than what we call today the SRE, the ops person, or what have you, and this whole IT stack of humanity. I think we need to examine that too. When when we're asking the developer to do the security and the testing, is he any better than the tester? Is there a difference? But we're going to save that one, I think, for another show. If you guys would like to come back on, and we can explore that a bit.
I'm back, but I categorically reject that whole hierarchy, and I also do not like the whole, notion when people say, hey, but the tools and everything, they would really help with the low skilled tester. That's another notion that kind of gets the hair on my neck stand up. It's just so annoying, and whether it's development or testing or any other data science, modeling, the UX design, it's the discipline. It's something that requires dedicated effort of studying, perfecting, thinking about the way how people do that work, and it requires intellect. That's the most important thing. Using some very powerful tools don't give you the license to turn off your brain. And again, happy to come back on the show and talk about the different career ladders and progressions, because again, it's it's gonna take us, longer to
Oh,
discuss.
that's a whole
it.
nother show.
You know that
I
I'm
can
gonna be
tell.
Yeah,
very,
there's
very
a lot to
and vocal
there's a
about
lot
that.
to say about
James?
that. But I just want to note that this whole issue has been studied in great depth in another field, in the field of the sociology of science. For instance, in physics, theorists are in the higher caste and experimentalists are in the lower caste. So if you're an engineer, you're in the lower caste. And they've studied this. How do these people cooperate? How do they assign prestige to each other? It's a well-known phenomenon in many fields of human endeavor.
And the same thing in math, right? The theoretical math versus applied math. The theoretical math seem to always think that they're the gods, and they're the ones that are, creating something that, will take centuries for the world to truly appreciate. And then you guys are in the applied math are solving the problems of today.
Exactly. Guys, we're out of time, but I'm going to hold this. I'm going to hold you both to it. We're going to come back on, not in the next show because I think we have something scheduled, but in one of the ones coming up, we'll have you both back on. Or maybe this will serve as part of our first roundtable in about a month from now when we'll open it up to the audience as well. But for now, Grigory, James, thank you. Yes.
Thanks,
James,
Alan.
Thank you. Gentlemen, it was a pleasure. This is Alan Schimmel. You just watched the very first DevOps Unbound. We'll be back in 2 weeks with a fresh panel, fresh topics. Stay tuned. Thanks again to Tricentis for sponsoring. And thank you for watching. Bye-bye.